Well, welcome friends. My name is Enton Eller, and I am hosting the webcast as far as the technical provisions for our time together this afternoon or this evening, depending on what time zone you happen to be in. I'm glad to have you all here, and I know more people are still joining us, so we'll get started here after just a few housekeeping items. First of all, most of you have discovered the chat up in the upper left-hand corner, and we invite you to use that at any time during this webcast as you want to ask questions or make comments, and we'll be able to gather those together. If you need technical help, please don't be afraid to post something there as well, and I'll do whatever I can to assist you. Also, if you see the information right above my head, we have a few other presentations that are yet to come and a few more that will be scheduled, so continue to check back and see more of what we have to offer. And finally, for those of you from the Church of the Brethren who would like to receive continuing education units for your participation today, we'll share that instruction for you at the end of the webcast so you can be sure to sign up and get those. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Stan Duick on the stage to introduce our speaker. And Stan, thank you for pulling all these webcasts together. Very, very much appreciate that. So Stan, take it away.
Well, we're grateful to our colleagues and partners in this effort with the Anabaptist Network UK, also Bristol Baptist College and Mennonite Trust, for which we are extremely grateful for their partnership with us on this venture as we present to you this series on the heart of Anabaptism. Today is the fourth webinar in this 7-part series that is exploring the themes on the heart of Anabaptism. These are the core convictions that are posted on the Anabaptist UK network site. And the convictions summarize the nucleus of Anabaptism and its contemporary significance. And throughout this series, we have invited 7 different presenters to reflect on these core convictions and what that means for us today. And so it's with great delight that we're able to bring to you Juliet Kilpin. And let me just say a few words about Juliet. This is not the first time she has presented with us. She's done a couple other events as well. But it's always a delight to have her because she's been a very popular presenter. But Juliet helps to coordinate urban expression, an urban mission agency pioneering creative and relevant forms of church in our inner cities. She is a mission advocate for 25 years. Juliet and her husband have formed a church with the first urban expression team in Tower Hamlets in East London, and she did that in 1997. She is also a freelance consultant and trainer, and she is the co-author of the book Church Planting in the Inner City, The Urban Expression Story, and has compiled Urban to the Core, Motives for Incarnational Mission. And so I know that you'll all be delighted with the content that she shares today as she helps us to reflect on this theme with us today. And so Juliet, it's a delight to have you, and please join us and welcome to our webcast.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for that introduction, Stan, and thank you very much, Enton, for putting this all together so effectively. And welcome everyone who's joined this evening. It's great to spend an hour with you. It's evening where I am in the UK. I don't know what time it is for you, but welcome. And I know this is being recorded as well, so for anyone who listens in at a later stage, thank you for dropping by and listening in. So as Stan says, we're going to be unpacking one of the Anabaptist core values this evening, and you have it on the screen here in front of you. And it's this: the frequent association of the church with status, wealth and force is inappropriate for followers of Jesus and damages our witness. We are committed to vulnerability and to exploring ways of being good news to the poor, the powerless and the persecuted, aware that such discipleship may attract opposition, resulting in suffering and sometimes ultimately martyrdom. So this is a really interesting value to be looking at, and I'm really pleased to be doing that this evening. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at it in 3 sections. So to begin with, I'm going to ask the question, is church associated with status, wealth and force? Secondly, I'm going to ask the question, why might that be inappropriate? And then in the 3rd section, I'm going to ask, therefore, how can we be good news to the poor in different kinds of ways? So I'm aiming to just do 12 or 15 minutes, and then we'll pause and Stan will take some questions. So if at any point you have a question or a comment, do write it up in the chat box, and Stan will kind of collate those so that we can kind of have some question and answer time in between these 3 sessions. So I hope that will work okay. So our first point then, is the church frequently associated with status, wealth and force? And if so, how? Well, I think that there are 3 particular areas to look at with this. So firstly, let's take a quick historical perspective to this. I guess for those of us from an Anabaptist tradition, we will know a little bit of history for this. And it's pretty clear, I think, that in years gone by, the church really has had quite a status. So in Christendom, certainly in Europe, that era where the church set the laws, it had ultimate status in our continent here. It set the law and it imposed its own way of doing things, its own expectations for what should be done. So much so that even things like baptism became the norm, and in fact it was illegal to not have your children baptised. And as many of you will know, that that's the roots of Anabaptism, isn't it? As people began to read scriptures for themselves and discover that maybe baptism might be a choice that you make as you choose to follow Jesus, when you are at a stage in your life where you can understand that better, that baptism is a choice. And so they rebelled a little bit against that status. I think in history as well, the church has looked really quite wealthy. Again, certainly during Christendom, if we read our history books, we discover that the Reformation was a time when the church's wealth was challenged. The church was guilty of taking taxes from people. They were guilty of taking money for something called indulgences, which was a way of getting your sins forgiven more effectively. And even going back before that, if we look at the New Testament, we see examples of Jesus getting cross with the wealth that seemed to be apparent within the temple, turning tables because it had become a den of robbers. Certainly some financial things going on there. And also in history, it's not too difficult, is it, to find out that that the church colluded very forcefully as well. The Crusades, a dark time in our history when force and the gospel went hand in hand, and people were forced to convert to Christianity. It wouldn't be something that most of us feel comfortable with now, I don't think. But also in more subtle ways, when mission trips have perhaps coerced people to attend churches in return for food. Some people were called rice Christians, that they became Christians because they were given free rice, and they were kind of coerced into that. And these are all things that are quite clear from our history. But what about today? What about a more contemporary perspective? Does the church still have that level of status or not? Well, I'm sure it's kind of changed over the years. But believe it or not, this evening I turned down an invitation to the House of Lords at our Parliament buildings here in the UK. And I found it quite ironic, really, that I had that invitation and I had to turn it down because I was presenting this value and exploring this value with you this evening. And certainly here in the UK, the church still has a really high measure of status, with bishops from the Church of England being able to sit in various houses and to have their opinions heard in terms of influencing the law. So it's still really a status. It's certainly in decline, very much so across here in Europe. And in other places in the world, it's probably on the rise. And so it changes depending on where you're looking at it from. What about wealth? Does the church still have significant amount of wealth today? Well, again, it's a matter of perspective, and some have more wealth than others. It's always easy to look at other groups and to consider that they may have more money than you do. But really, any church groups that have land or buildings or artifacts really are considerably well off. Not to mention those that have their own private jets, but we won't talk about those. Churches seem to manage to get money in lots of different ways. Here in the UK, some churches get a percentage of tax. When people give money to churches, they can claim back some of the tax through something called gift aid. And some people feel very comfortable with that. Others feel that that's perhaps a sneaky way of just getting some extra money. And throughout the years, people have challenged some of this, of course. The Occupy movement here in the UK and in other places certainly tried to challenge the church's stance and collusion with wealth, certainly in the banks. But what about today in terms of force? Are churches engaged with using force or not? I'm sure for many of us, it doesn't feel quite so apparent that the church uses force. But are there still subtle ways that we use it? I've certainly been involved in churches where at a certain time of year, suddenly you see lots more families turning up. And the reason they turn up is because here in the UK, we have a significant number of church-run schools. And in order to get your child into that school, and to be fair, a lot of those schools are some of the best schools that we have in the country. But in order to get your child into that school, you need a reference from your local church of one denomination or another. And so suddenly there's an increase in the number of families who come in order to try and persuade you that they are regular attenders and get a reference. Is that a measure of force? That in order for people to go to one of the best schools in the country, they have to attend church? I don't know. What about other little forms of coercion? Again, here in the UK, we have various youth organisations. Often they are uniformed youth organisations, and they might meet together midweek. And often when children turn up at those midweek youth groups, they give their money for the week, but sometimes they're asked questions and they get certain points to go towards badges or awards, depending on how they answer those questions. And questions are sometimes about whether they attended church the previous Sunday. If they did, they would get a tick in that box. If they didn't, they don't. Also, some of those youth organisations, the children are supposed to attend church once a month for something that we call the church parade. Again, is that just a fantastic opportunity to be able to present children that wouldn't normally go to church with some truths about Christianity? Or is it a little bit of coercion that is still apparent today? Like I said, there are various groups that have challenged some of these approaches. The Occupy movement started outside St Paul's Cathedral in London for us here, and they were very upset with some of the collusion that they felt was going on, and they were calling the church to stand against some of the misdemeanours of the banks at the time. And I guess there's always that temptation of colluding with power. I love this banner that was here. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, there will be peace on earth. How do we manage to do that? And then finally, just this section, a question just about our perspective, really. I love this banner as well that was at the Occupy movement. We are the 99%. And certainly here in the UK, there has been this kind of slogan about being the 99%, the feeling that there is a 1% that holds all the control and the wealth, and the 99% have to do with far less. I guess that depends a little bit on the third point here, on our global perspective on things as to whether the church is still associated with status, wealth, and force. Because we only see from inside our own perspective there, don't we? We only ever perceive our own motives. It takes a willingness to see things from other people's perspectives. And I guess for me, I'm used to Christianity being a global north majority thing. But the reality is that the church globally is becoming a global south majority thing. And certainly for me, that opens my eyes as to how wealthy the church really has become when we compare it with the church in other parts of the world. Let me just show you an example of this. This isn't related to the church, but related to individuals. There's a nice little website called theglobalrichlist.net. And in that you can put your income and see where you stand globally in terms of how rich you are. So here in the UK, the average salary apparently is £25,000. If you earn £25,000, you are here. Let me get the, here we go. You would be here. And that would put you just outside at the top 1% of the richest people in the world. Some people probably don't earn the average and might be thinking, oh, if only I earned the average. Well, let's bring that down a bit. If you earn £18,000 a year, you're still in the 2.5 richest percentage in the world. And let's bring it down a little bit more. So maybe you earn £12,000 a year in the UK. That'd be very difficult, really, to make ends meet on £12,000 a year. But you are still in the top 7.43% richest people in the world by income. So is the church rich? Does it have status? Does it still use force? I guess it depends a little bit from the perspective that we look at it from. So let's just pause for a moment after that introduction and see what kind of questions or comments we have had.
Hi, Juliet. I'm going to join you because Stan had to step away for a moment. But I'll not only invite our participants to reflect on whether they think the church still has that power and status and force, but I'll just say that you've hit the United States in the middle of this election cycle, and it's really interesting how much pull, at least being associated with the church, still has as you look at all that's being said, even to things like the comments about having to register all the Muslims, assumes a position of the non-Muslim, the more Christian, the more churchy kind of places that sometimes is said louder than others, but it's clear that there's still a big tug there, even though the government officially has tried to somewhat disassociate.
Certainly, it's very easy to fall into that, isn't it? Even if we don't want to use that status or that area of comfort that we inhabit, that actually, you know, when we're feeling fearful, when we're feeling threatened, it's really easy to just fall into that standpoint, and yes, to use force against those that we don't agree with. Yeah.
But then it becomes force also not only in the name of national security, but in the name of the church, because we don't have to use that force against Christians, for instance. We're glad to let Christian refugees from Syria come into the United States, but not Muslim refugees. So yeah, there's that force. I'm glad to see some others are starting to type, but I'll invite all of you who are participating in our podcast today to think about the ways that you see that the church may still be associated with that power or that authority, even in more subtle ways than in the past. Bruce and Mary Sue wrote, in the U.S., we still have tax reliefs for church buildings as well as for clergy, as well as you mentioned, for donations to any nonprofits of which churches are included.
Absolutely. Now, that's a good example, isn't it, really? And it's funny, isn't it, how readily we pursue those tax reliefs. You know, we see that that's an option, and so we very rapidly think, oh, well, maybe, you know, we should go for that because we should be entitled to it, and it will do us good and it will serve the kingdom of God. And we find lots of different ways of justifying it, and actually to take a step back and ask the question, is this a good thing to do? Is this a misuse of force? It's very difficult to find the space to ask those kinds of questions, and it takes some brave people sometimes to say, let's just stop here and ask a bigger question before we just do what is automatically assumed as the correct thing.
Although I'll notice there's an assumption in what you just said, Juliet, which is assuming that having that force or that power is not necessarily a good thing. That's certainly an Anabaptist sort of perspective, but I'm hoping you'll unpack that a little bit more for us, because many of my colleagues think that having that power is always a good thing, because the church of anyone or of anything should have the power, because somehow that helps bring in God's kingdom. If the church has the power,
and that's a fascinating question as to whether you see more of God when you have power, or whether you see more of God when you don't have power. And yes, I'll certainly throw in a few examples about that in a few minutes time.
Good. We've got another comment from Bob Alloway. He says, note that gift aid in the UK is for any charity.
Yeah. No, that's a helpful clarification. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So any charity can claim that gift aid, which is like a tax relief, really. I think the question about it sometimes comes, particularly from churches, as to whether they are being charitable in what they're doing, or whether they are actually being very self-serving, which a lot of clubs can fall into, but also some churches may not do anything very significant for anybody beyond the church. And then the question as to whether they are in fact being charitable looms over them. But yes, that's helpful.
That's an interesting perspective to think about too. Angie adds, as a healthcare chaplain, I wear a collar, albeit I am a nonconformist. Relating to others, they give me power. I have to be careful how...
No, that's really helpful. And yes, Angie, you're certainly nonconformist in lots of ways, Angie, and it's great to have you here. And yes, I'm sure, that knowing Angie very well, that would be an interesting dilemma of wearing a dog collar and seeing perhaps the respect that you get, and also the freedom to be able to talk to people, and the freedom to be approached by people can be perceived as a really beneficial thing, and it is a really beneficial thing. But there are also dangers that can come with that. So I think that's really helpful when you see that someone is asking those questions, because it probably means that they're trying to resist the privileges that come from that. Yeah, let's go for it.
Shall I let you
Fantastic.
continue?
Thank you, everybody, for some of your comments. Do feel free to add more into there as well. So let's go on to our second section. And it's this. So why is this frequent association of the church with status, wealth and force inappropriate for followers of Jesus? How does it damage our witness? And some people may not feel it's inappropriate at all, but certainly from an Anabaptist perspective, that would be the viewpoint. Excuse me. So I want us to explore 3 questions to help us think about this as to why it may or may not be inappropriate. So the first question would be this. Is it what Jesus did? How did Jesus relate to power and wealth and force. And a writer called Anne Morrissey, she's written some fantastic books. One of them is called Journeying Out. And when she talks about Jesus, she talks about how he lived his life distinctively in several areas, but three in particular that relate to our topic. She talks about him eschewing power. That's not a word that I would normally use. It simply means avoiding something because of a moral imperative. So avoiding power because you don't feel it's the right thing. And she says that Jesus resisted that power. And another friend of mine, Al Barrett, who's an Anglican minister, he says that when Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted, he shows how he resisted that power in three particular ways. So he says that he resisted the temptation to be provider when he was offered bread. You know, he could have fed lots of people with that bread, but he resisted that power. He resisted the temptation to become possessor. So when he was offered the kingdom, he resisted that temptation to possess a land. And thirdly, he resisted the temptation to become a performer. So the temptation of, you know, look what you could do if people see you jump off the cliff and not to be scathed. Look at the authority you would have. Look at the power that would come with that, the influence. And Al Barrett says that Jesus resisted all of those. And I think that's what Anne Morrissey is getting at here. She also said that he was willing to risk being overwhelmed. And I find this really interesting because I think in churches often we really do like to be in control of things. We feel uncomfortable when we are not in control of what's going on around us. And yet actually when you look at Jesus' life, there were moments where maybe there was a sense of him risking being overwhelmed when he was surrounded by crowds of people. Crowds can be scary places. They can quickly tip from being friendly to being aggressive. When he was imprisoned, was there a sense of him allowing himself to be overwhelmed in those situations? I just think that's an interesting point. And also the fact that Jesus invested in the most unlikely. So he didn't actually choose the most powerful people or the people with the best reputations to be within his inner core of people. He invested in the most unlikely. And that seems to go against what we tend to do as churches often. We invest in the most likely. And perhaps there's a challenge there to look beyond that. So the second question is, does this approach help us understand the Bible at all? When you are in a context where you have status, wealth, or use force, does that really help us understand the Bible at all? And I just want to throw in a little story here, which has helped me just rethink this quite considerably, actually. So Enton mentioned the refugee crisis earlier, and Syrian refugees and others. And here in Europe, we're facing the largest movement of people across our continent since the Second World War. It's truly quite a phenomenal thing that's going on. We're slightly set apart from it here in the UK because we are an island, and I'm learning how much of an island mentality we have, really. But just over, excuse me, just over our border in France, just over the Channel, a mere 22 miles away, there's a French town there called Calais, and it's where a lot of the refugees are ending up. Many of them want to come to the UK, and so they get to this part of France and then realise that actually England is a really difficult country to get to, and we're not as welcoming of refugees as many of us would like us to be. So I've been going over to a refugee camp that has formed there. Many people call it the jungle. I don't like that name, and neither do the people that live there. But there's a couple of pictures here on this screen about it. And as you can see, it's a very muddy place. It really is like a shanty town that you might find in South America or in parts of Africa or South Asia. Really quite an appalling place, to be honest. But there was this beautiful story, just profound. There's a friend of mine, and he is a refugee from Sudan, and he runs a little distribution centre in the camp, helping to give out shoes and clothes and sleeping bags and food to people in his area of the camp, in a way of trying to humanise the distribution more than just giving it to long lines of people. And as you can see, it's very muddy. It's not a great place if you don't have shoes. And there are lots of reasons that people don't have shoes, which I won't go into. But there was this instance where there was a crowd of people, and you can see in one of these pictures that line of men waiting at the distribution centre. And there was maybe 5, 6, 7 times more men than that. So it was quite a crowd. And a man came up to my friend and asked him for shoes. He desperately needed shoes. And my friend said, I don't have any shoes. It wasn't the day for shoes at the distribution centre. And yet this man, he was so desperate, he began to get quite cross and saying, I need shoes, I need shoes. And my friend again was trying to calm him down, just to say, my friend, we don't have any shoes. The man wouldn't take this at all, and he was getting more and more frustrated, and wouldn't take this answer from my friend. And eventually my friend bent down and he took off his shoes, and he stood in that mud that you can see there, and he gave his shoes to the man that was asking for them. And he said, I don't have any shoes, but you can have mine. And what happened then was fascinating, because at that moment the man realised that my friend was in exactly the same position as him, that he had nothing more than him, but he was prepared to give what he had. And it was a very peacemaking gesture, because the man's anger subsided. He understood that my friend was in the same predicament, and he said, no, I don't want your shoes, I just want shoes. At which point my friend put his own shoes back on, and they hugged each other, and they shared a moment of understanding their joint poverty. And you know, that story just opened my eyes. You know, the story in Matthew 5, where Jesus is talking about loving our enemies, and he says, if anyone sues you and wants to take your shirt, let them take your tunic too. Now, I've understood that in 2 different ways already so far. One is that Jesus is calling us to be extra generous. I've also understood it from an Anabaptist perspective, that actually this could be a non-violent, provocative action. That if you only wore a shirt and a tunic, if they ask for your shirt and Jesus says give them your tunic too, it basically may leave you standing there naked, in a way shaming the other person that they are taking everything that you have. I've understood it in those 2 ways. But watching my friend in this place of absolute abject poverty made me also realise that this is an incredibly peaceable act. And it's a way of diffusing anger. It's a way of levelling the conversation. It was just peacemaking in the midst of poverty, which raises all sorts of questions about Jesus' status and the status of the people with whom he was ministering at that time. Working with people in poverty helps us, I think, to understand the Bible a lot more. And thirdly, and lastly, just for this little bit, do we potentially also deceive ourselves if we always look at things from a perspective of wealth and status? If we look at things from that perspective, we have a certain view of status. We have a certain view of success, what success looks like. And yet perhaps that is deceiving ourselves as to genuinely what success can look like. Fantastic quote here from a brilliant book called Exclusion and Embrace. It says this: to claim the comfort of the crucified while rejecting his way is to advocate not only cheap grace, but a deceitful ideology. I just find that quite challenging, and certainly for me, the more time I'm spending in this refugee camp in Calais, the more I'm seeing that perhaps my framework of looking at things, which has been shaped in my context, in a church that probably does have considerable wealth and status, perhaps has not been the most helpful. And then, so just a couple of comments, and then we're going to have some questions again. This is my last slide for this section. How does it damage our witness if we only look at things from that perspective? How does it damage our witness? I'd just like to throw in a few comments here. That a church at the centre of things takes influence for granted and seeks to exert control. So when we are used to being a church at the centre with that status, with a level of influence, we take that for granted as being normal, and it's very easy to exert control without even realising it. A church in the majority has a lot of vested interest in the status quo and not much vision for anything different. We might enjoy the status quo, how things are, because it works well. Why would we want anything to change? If things change, it might mean that we are more uncomfortable. A church that is established is not very flexible, to be honest. A church that is established has its ways to keep, it has its methods and its processes, and often the wheels turn very slowly. A church that has privileges very easily becomes dominant because it doesn't want to let go of those privileges. Why would you want to let go of privileges and safety if you have it? And a church that presumes that everyone knows its story lacks creativity in terms of how it communicates that. So again, just with this kind of dominance and influence, if we presume that everyone knows who we are and knows what we're all about, then we might not think very creatively about how to communicate that. And then finally, I'd suggest that a church that becomes institutional actually can lack adventure. It becomes very safe and very risk averse. And I wonder whether that's appropriate in contexts where the majority of people need to find new ways of encountering Jesus, and the church needs to be adventurous to try and find those ways and to join in with what God is doing beyond our own walls. So there's a few other things for us to think about. Again, let's just take a pause, and Stan or Enton could come back in and help us think through a few questions and comments. Hi, Stan.
Hi, Juliet. Good to be with you again. Bob shared a comment. He said, we hear stories from base communities in South America of how those reading the Bible in poverty have a better understanding of it in context. And how would you respond to Bob and to our audience today regarding his comment and how it is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that, really. I think whenever I have visited places of poverty and taken time to read the Bible from that context, it has opened my eyes to understand what is going on there, really. And, you know, we read the Bible through our own lenses, don't we? So if we read it from a context of privilege and wealth and feeling settled, then we read that into the stories that we read. We just assume that they're in the same context. And yet more and more, especially as I spend time with people who are displaced and people who are really in abject poverty, people who are very powerless to do anything about their circumstances, I get glimpses of Jesus in that. And yeah, certainly in the camp in Calais, there have been numerous times where I've watched people like my friend, and it's just hit me. I've got, oh my gosh, I can see that is exactly what Jesus was meaning when he said that thing. So yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. In your previous slide where you had those comments about the church where it's not flexible, those kinds of things. When I saw that, what came to mind for me was it then becomes a church that reinforces biases, and so it's difficult. And what does that say about us in the human condition in our relationship to Christ? If this is what we as supposedly followers of Jesus do, is that we reinforce biases.
Yeah, no, that's a real challenge, isn't it? And I guess the question is, well, how do you do the opposite to that? How do you not reinforce those biases? And perhaps that is by embracing diversity and intentionally choosing to see things from different perspectives. And I'm not so sure that we're always very good at doing that in the church. You know, I've grown up in a Christian tradition that has encouraged me to only make friends with Christians, and not only to come to church on Sunday twice on a Sunday, but also to go to all the other activities throughout the week, so I don't have any time to go and meet people who are not like us. And that just reaffirms my biases. The more I spend time with people beyond church, the more I'm completely convinced that God is able to move beyond the church and God's kingdom is out there as well. And there's a challenge to release ourselves from some of those structures to go and find it and go and join in with what God is already doing.
Yeah. With that list, what are one or two points that you feel churches that are faith communities that you come across and encounter? Which ones of those do they seem to struggle with the most from your experience?
That's a really good question. Do you know, I do think the flexibility, I mean, there's key words there, aren't there? Like, so flexibility, creativity, adventure, they're words that express some ability to think beyond themselves and to take risks. And I think there are a lot of churches that struggle to take risks and to really try something that's significantly different. You know, we might try to tweak what we have. So we tweak the church service to do something a bit different, or we tweak another activity we do to try and be more inclusive. But we really struggle sometimes to have the courage to do something just completely different, to say, let's throw it up in the air and see what lands. You know, let's just sell the building and see what it's like being church without a building. Or let's get rid of all of our money and see what it's like being church without any money. Or, you know, it's very difficult to do that because we actually have vested interest in having the building or having the money, or whatever. So I think courage to be flexible and adventurous, really.
Does kind of in that courage, does that say something about us as a church and our witness about, I guess, as fear that it means perhaps deep down that we are maybe more fearful of the unknown and the possibility than what we're willing to admit? And how might we go about working through
that's
that?
a really helpful comment. Jesus said to his disciples, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm going to leave the counselor to be with you." And yet, actually, I think you're right. We are quite fearful. We're fearful of the other. We're fearful of being different. We're fearful of rocking the boat. I think we're fearful of, just needing permission to do things. And that maybe comes from, the authority that the church has gleaned over centuries, that we feel that we need permission to do things. So my hunch is that there are lots of people with a kind of a gut feeling that they should do something, but perhaps they hold back because they're not sure what their pastor would think, or they're not sure what other Christians would think. It's a shame. But I think one way to respond to that, I think, is to learn how to take risks. And, you do that a little bit at a time. Someone doesn't learn to do tricks on a high wire 20 foot off the ground on day one. They practice with the high wire 1 inch off the floor, and they see what happens. And so perhaps for all of us, there are small risks that we can take following that Holy Spirit leading, and see whether we got it right or not, perhaps.
Yeah. Two comments here. Enton makes one, and the fearfulness strips us of our creativity to be church in new ways. And Bob also adds, when you have nothing, you have nothing to lose. So yes, helps creativity. At the same time, having a building can be a resource to move the community around, being a church without walls. That's a good way to frame it.
No,
a church
absolutely.
without walls.
I love that phrase there, Bob, that, when you have nothing to lose. And I'll pick that up in just a minute before we finish. I think I have seen that, certainly in the camp that I have been visiting, and I think that teaches me a lot about some of the things that Jesus said.
Well, I'm going to step aside, and Juliet, so you can continue.
That's great, thank you. So just to finish things up for this session. So finally, we want to ask, how can we be committed to exploring ways of being good news to the poor, the powerless, and the persecuted? I think, first of all, it's interesting, isn't it? Even in that question, there are lots of assumptions in here, because we could rephrase that from a completely different perspective. Let's reframe it this way. We could say, for example, how can we be committed to hearing good news from the poor, the powerless, and the persecuted? Because perhaps you only understand the good news fully if you are poor. So it's very interesting, isn't it? We always assume, I always assume, that I am the one to bring good news. And yet actually, maybe I need to hear the good news from people in a very different context to me. Or what about a second way of reframing that question? How can we be committed to sharing our experiences of being poor, powerless, and persecuted with the rich, the powerful, and the protected? In the original question, I'm assuming that everyone listening to this is not poor or powerless or persecuted. And it happens a lot in the way we lead things, the assumptions that we make. We presume that people are in one position when perhaps they may be in a different position. But anyway, that's just a side, really. I think there are three things that we can look at to help us be committed to exploring ways of being good news to the poor, the powerless and the persecuted. Firstly, is simply about our attitude. And I think when we realise that the church throughout history and even in contemporary society and certainly globally is a really rich status-filled church, it may just help us to change our posture and our tone when we talk with people, when we become aware of how easy it is to exert control. It may mean that we look at that seriously and try and proactively choose to have a less controlling stance. So it's just an attitude that we can change our attitude in order to have a different posture or a different tone. I think availability is also really important. And we mentioned it a little bit earlier of how we can become available and free from some of the constraints that would prevent us from venturing out. Freeing ourselves from the traps of control or power, making sure that we're not so programmed in our church life and in our church experience that we can't be flexible at all. And thirdly, having an awareness, just making sure that we look at things from different perspectives, as we were just talking about. Those different biases can be remedied if we open our eyes and see things from a different perspective. We open our eyes when we see, and that comes from spending time with people who are not like us. And so maybe that can be a very intentional, strategic thing that we can do. And there are lots of different ways of doing that as individuals, just choosing to take time to do things, but maybe there are some strategies that churches could take to encourage people to do that as well. In contrast to the points that I've put up earlier, here are some contrasting points. I think a church that is at the margins looks for what God is doing at the edges. So maybe that's something that we can do. A church that is a minority or recognises that it's becoming a minority recovers a prophetic calling. And so, there's something positive about being a minority. We don't have to be fearful. There are good things that can come from that. A church that is unsettled develops countercultural reflexes rather than just going with the status quo, and that can only be a good thing. A church without privileges seeks justice for all and understands powerlessness. A church without privileges won't only be concerned for its own privileges anymore, but actually will be aware of what it feels like to be powerless, what it feels like to be a victim of injustice, and it will seek the welfare for everybody. A church that presumes many don't know its story may be more humble in the way it communicates that story, rather than assuming that everybody knows what it's trying to say. And a church that resists institutionalisation remains lightweight. It remains flexible, able to move quickly, able to respond to changes that are going on in culture or in society or in the world, rather than getting bogged down with processes that are going to go too slowly for them to keep up with things. Let me just give you an example of a church as I finish this up. So I mentioned the refugee camp in Calais, and this is an aerial view of that camp. It's a little bit out of date, so it has changed since then. It has grown since this picture was taken. I think when this picture was taken, there was probably about 6,000 or 7,000 people living within this square mile, mostly in tents, although some of those tents have begun to become shelters, and it's really becoming like a little urban city. in the middle of this community, which is made up of people from all over the world, not only from Syria, but Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Eritrea, and just all over the place. Excuse me. But in the middle of this camp is a church, and it's been built by the Eritrean and Ethiopian communities as a place of sanctuary in the midst of this camp. This church made literally out of beams of wood and tarpaulin, canvas. In the middle picture there, you can see the front of part of the front of the church, and you can see here that on this beam, they like to decorate the church all in white, and this beam is decorated with toilet paper. I've never been in a church that's been decorated with toilet paper before. The Christmas trees outside of this Orthodox Christian church, they celebrated Christmas just last week. The tree is decorated with rubbish that they found. Anything glittery has gone on it. Just incredibly humbling to see this church created by people that have been displaced. People with so little have lovingly created this place. And when I first visited this church back in August, before it had a lot of this stuff in it, I remember walking in and asking if it was okay to come and visit the church, and the guys there immediately just said, this church is for everybody. Muslim, Christian, black, white, we're all brothers and sisters, everybody is welcome here. Such an amazing warmth and welcome. And yet in the midst of this, as this church and this community faces evictions and more displacement, this church is showing me something of what it means to be church in society, and is reflecting very much some of the attributes that I see Jesus living through the Gospels. I have to read this out. This is just a final quote. Actually, no, I'll come back to that. Let me pause, because I'm going to have to find that quote to read out to you, because that's obviously a little bit dark on there. So let me just pause for a minute as we begin to bring this to a close. Stan. Oh, enter me there.
Well, Juliet, while people are thinking, and also we've invited people to share their thoughts about what you shared about attitude, availability, and awareness. And Enton, also, if you're available, if you could step on and just share some of the housekeeping things that we have here at the end, and then we can continue with our conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I'll just share the instructions for those of you that wish to obtain continuing education units. I've posted them there in the middle, and I'll also put them live into the chat window. And also put up 2 quick questions. The first is, how helpful was the presentation, meaning the content and the learning that Juliet has been able to share with us? And the second is, how well did you like this webinar format? And so it's just evaluating our tech for now. But that's all the housekeeping that I need at this point. So Stan and Juliet, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Juliet, were you able to find that?
Yeah. No, I have it. So okay. Unfortunately, the slide that's on here is quite dark. But let me just read out to you. This is really just my thoughts in conclusion, really. Because the final point of the value that we're looking at this evening said that this kind of discipleship might attract opposition, suffering, and martyrdom. And I thought I would just ask the question, well, why might it attract opposition, suffering, or martyrdom? And I've written down on this slide, for those in power, there is business in making and keeping people poor and or illegal. There is money to be made in fences, bombs, and displacement. The poorest face the powerlessness of this objectification every day, but in a moment, the middle class, precarious people can also be made poor. If you truly stand in solidarity with the poor, their risks become your risks. Their fight for justice becomes your fight for justice. Their search for freedom becomes your search for freedom. The life they find in death becomes the life you also find in death. You become united, and the last thing those in power want is a united, peaceful rebellion, because where is the money in that? And so it is quite easy to become a victim of suffering and martyrdom if you choose to go down that path. And just finally, and in concluding here, I was reminded of the words that Jesus read when he unrolled the scroll in the temple from Luke chapter 4, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." No wonder Jesus got killed when he was seeking to release captives and let the oppressed go free, because there is money in keeping people captive. There is money in keeping people oppressed. And those who like wealth, who like status, and who are prepared to use force will do anything to keep that power. So so that just brings my thoughts to a conclusion, really. It's been really good to explore this value with you. Thank you for your questions and your comments. I know there are other webinars available, so do tune in and listen to some other ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, for sharing such wonderful content with us. And we're seeing that people are agreeing as well. As you were finishing your closing thoughts, it kind of hit me that perhaps in order for those of us in power, we may not see it that way, but it really takes some courage and humility to be able to say we're going to, want to be or allow ourselves to be on an equal footing with others and to share. So it's really, the gospel is transformative, and perhaps we are the ones that are in most need of transformation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The kind of brings back to mind an old book that Walter Brueggemann wrote on evangelism, where he said that those who need evangelism are those who have heard the story, but are those who have forgotten the story.
Yeah.
So, and perhaps that says something about to us. So,
Great.
Well, Juliet, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. You're always a delight to have with us, and also you bring such value in what you share with your content. And always look forward to having you as a presenter on these webinars. And we hope we'll be connecting with you again in another one down the road.
So, thank you.
Are there any final thoughts that you want to share as well as we close off?
For me?
Yes.
No, I don't think so, other than just to encourage people to be courageous. I think God is doing some quite remarkable things outside of the church, and it would be a real shame if we missed that. So be courageous and look at where God is moving, and join in.
And for those of you that have stories of courage and humility that you would like to share, we'd love to hear those from you. And so I invite you to send your email to me Stan Duick at sduick@brethren.org. Oops, let me do that again. See what happens when you type under pressure. And we'd be delighted to hear your stories of courage, or those that you're aware of, stories of courage and humility, of risk-taking, that we can share and pass along to others. I want to thank everyone for attending today. We appreciate your participation and support. And just to make you aware, our next webinar in this series is scheduled for Thursday, February 11th. And we're going to be talking about spirituality and economics. So just kind of picking up on where Juliet has taken us a bit today. And our presenter on the 11th is Joanna Frew. And so she lives and works in the House of Hospitality, and with her partner that runs a place for asylum seekers. And so that is going to be a very fascinating webinar, and we look forward to Joe's presentation on that day. So we welcome you here today and invite you back again on February 11th. Hope that you all have a blessed week and day, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.